A dealership mechanic with a laptop and a $9,000 quote stood in a machine shed in Nebraska and watched a 22-year-old kid press his bare hand against a spinning gearbox and said nothing wrong for the next 11 years. That's not the end of the story. That's the middle. Let me start where it actually begins, because you need to understand where this kind of knowing comes from before you can understand what it's worth. In the winter of 1983, a man named Walter Kessler stood in a pole shed on his family's 640 acres outside Broken Bow, Custer County, Nebraska, and listened to a transmission that had started whining. Not grinding, not clunking. Whining, a high, thin sound that came in only under load, only in third gear, only when the hydraulics were also engaged. Most men would not have noticed it at all. Walter noticed it because he had been driving that same International Harvester 1466 for 9 years, since the day he bought it new off the lot in 1974. And in 9 years a man learns a machine the way he learns a spouse. He knows the difference between a bad mood and a real problem. Walter was 54 that winter. He'd farmed the same ground his father had homesteaded in 1919, wheat and milo mostly, with cattle on the pasture ground that wasn't worth plowing. He was not an educated man in the way that word gets used in town. He had an 8th grade education and a mind that worked like a lever, slow to move. But once it moved something heavy. He did not read manuals for pleasure. He read them because a manual was a conversation somebody smarter than him had already had with the machine, and it seemed foolish not to listen in. He drove the 1466 into International Harvester's dealership in Kearney that November and described the whine to the service manager, a sharp young man named Russ Palladino who'd been running that department for years and had a wall of certificates behind his desk to prove he knew what he was doing. Russ listened, nodded, ran a few numbers, and told Walter the input shaft bearings in the transmission were likely worn, and the whole transmission would need to come apart, parts and labor. Call it $3,600 in 1983, on a wheat farm that had just come off to bad harvest years. That number sat in the room like a dead animal nobody wanted to touch. Walter said he'd think about it. He drove home, and he did not think about it the way you'd expect. He thought about it with a wrench in his hand, over that winter, in a shed heated by a single wood stove that barely kept the frost off the concrete. Walter Kessler pulled that transmission down himself. He had borrowed a service manual from a neighbor and bought a cheap dial indicator from the farm supply store, and he worked through it the only way he knew how, slowly, methodically, writing every measurement down in a notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. He found the problem was not the input shaft at all. It was a single worn thrust washer, a $2 part, that had let just enough end play develop in the shaft to change the mesh of one gear pair under load. That was the whine, not a transmission failure. A $2 washer. He replaced it, reassembled the whole unit, and ran that tractor for another 11 years before it needed anything more than oil and filters. Now here's the part of the story that matters more than the washer. Walter had a son, Daniel, who was 12 years old that winter, and Daniel spent most evenings of that January and February sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket by the wood stove, not because anyone told him to, but because the house was crowded with 2 younger sisters and the shed was quiet. Walter never once sat Daniel down and explained anything. He just worked, and when Daniel asked something, he answered it plainly, and when Daniel didn't ask, he let the silence do the teaching. That's an old kind of instruction. It doesn't have a name in any classroom, but it's how most real skill has moved between generations of people who work with their hands, going back further than anyone bothered to write down. By the time Daniel was 16, he could diagnose a rough idle by ear from across the yard. By the time he was 20, he'd rebuilt the engines himself, with Walter mostly standing back and commenting only when something was worth commenting on. And when Daniel had his own son years later, a boy named Cole, born in 1997, the same pattern repeated itself without anyone planning it that way. Cole grew up underfoot in that same shed, handed wrenches before he could read, and absorbed the sound of a healthy diesel engine, the way other kids absorb the sound of their own last. Name, there's a particular kind of learning that happens when a child spends 10,000 hours next to someone who knows what they're doing and isn't trying to teach anything. It doesn't look like education. There's no test, no certificate, no moment where anyone declares the student ready. It just accumulates, quietly, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, until one day there's enough of it to stand on. By the time Cole Kessler was 14, he'd helped his father and grandfather. Walter was in his 80s by then, still walking out to the shed most mornings even though his hands had gone unsteady, rebuild a combine header and to tractor engines. By 16, he was doing full diagnostics on his own, filling notebooks the way his father and grandfather had filled notebooks before him. He was, by every account from people who knew the family, exactly what you'd expect from 3 generations of the same quiet obsession, patient, unhurried, and better at listening to a machine than most kids his age were at listening to a teacher. But here's where the story stops being a nostalgic one about the old ways and starts being about something sharper. Because the equipment Cole grew up around was not the equipment his grandfather had learned on. By the time Cole turned 18, the tractors and combines rolling across Custer County were no longer simple mechanical systems you could take apart with a wrench and a notebook. They were rolling computers, engines managed by electronic control units, hydraulics governed by sensors, fuel systems calibrated by software that adjusted itself hundreds of times a second. The old kind of listening, the kind Walter had used to find a $2 washer in 1983, was supposed to be obsolete. Every dealership in the state would have told you that. Every certified technician would have told you that a diagnostic laptop had made the human irrelevant. Nobody told Cole Kessler that. Or rather, plenty of people told him that. He just didn't believe it, because he had grown up watching the generations of men prove otherwise on machines that were supposedly simpler and shouldn't have been beatable either. What Cole understood, in a way he couldn't always put into words, was that a computer can only find what it was programmed to look for. A person who has spent a lifetime listening can find what nobody thought to look for at all. That gap between what a machine can detect and what a person can notice is where this story lives. And in the spring of 2019, that gap was about to cost a man named Ellis Bramwell $11,000, until a 22-year-old with grease under his fingernails and his grandfather's old canvas coat walked into a machine shed 3 miles down the road and put his hand flat against a piece of steel that was trying to tell everyone something the computer couldn't hear. Here's the number that started it all, $11,000 for $100. That's what a John Deere dealership quoted a desperate farmer for a problem that turned out to cost $41 to fix, and the only reason anyone found out was because a 22-year-old refused to trust a screen over his own to hands. Ellis Bramwell farmed 1,100 acres of irrigated corn and soybeans east of Broken Bow, one of the bigger operations left in that stretch of Custer County. And in April of 2019, his newest combine, a machine that had cost more than most houses in town, started doing something that made no sense to anybody. Under heavy load, harvesting standing corn at full header width, the engine would suddenly cut power by nearly half for anywhere from 10 to 40 seconds, then recover on its own like nothing had happened. No warning light, no fault code stored in the system, no pattern the dealership's diagnostic software could pin down. Even after 3 separate visits from the service truck, the dealership in Kearney, the same one Walter Kessler had walked into 36 years earlier, now 3 times the size with a service bay full of laptops instead of dial indicators, had already replaced the fuel injectors at a cost of $3,000 to $100. The problem continued. They'd replaced the engine control module for another $2,800. The problem continued. They'd called the manufacturer's regional technical support line, gone through an extended diagnostic protocol, and been told the next step was replacing the entire wiring harness that ran from the cab to the engine bay, a job quoted at $5,000 for $100 in parts and labor. Total bill, if Ellis went ahead with it, would land somewhere north of $11,000, and there was no guarantee it would fix anything, because nobody could explain why the problem was happening in the first place. They were replacing parts based on probability, not understanding. Ellis Bramwell was 58 years old and had never in his life paid a repair bill without knowing what it was for. He sat in his kitchen with the estimate in front of him and did the math on what that money represented against a corn price that hadn't been kind to anybody in 3 years. And then he did something he later admitted he almost didn't do, because it felt a little foolish for a man his age to be asking a kid, barely out of his teens, for help. He drove to the Kessler place. He didn't ask for Daniel. Daniel was at the elevator that afternoon. He found Cole in the shed, up to his elbows in a neighbor's baler, and told him the whole story: the power drops, the 3 dealership visits, the $11,000 number that was sitting on his kitchen table like an accusation. Cole listened without interrupting, the way his father and grandfather had taught him, without ever saying a word about it. When Ellis finished, Cole asked him 3 things. He asked whether the power loss happened more in the morning, with dew still heavy on the corn, or in the afternoon once things had dried out. He asked whether it happened more on the low end of a field or the high end, whether the ground was flat or had a grade to it, and he asked whether Ellis had noticed anything unusual in the cab at the moment it happened. Any flicker in the lights, any stutter in the display screen, anything at all. Even something that felt too small to mention. Ellis thought about it and said, "Actually, yes, sometimes the radio would cut out for a second right when the power dropped." He'd mentioned that to the dealership. They'd told him it was unrelated. Cole wrote it down and said he'd come take a look. He showed up at Ellis's place 2 days later with the same tool bag his father had built up over 20 years, a compression tester, a set of feeler gauges, a skin tool he'd bought used out of Grand Island, and a notebook, the 4th one he'd filled since he was 16. He spent the first hour not touching a single component. He climbed into the cab, ran the combine at full load on flat, dry ground for 20 minutes with nothing happening, and then had Ellis drive it onto a section with a slight grade, where the ground had more moisture underneath. 12 minutes in, the power dropped. The radio cut out at the exact same moment. That detail, the radio, was the thread Cole pulled. A power drop with no fault code meant the engine control system was reacting to bad information, not a real mechanical failure. A radio cutting out at the same instant meant something was interrupting the electrical system more broadly, not just one sensor circuit. That ruled out the fuel injectors and the engine control module entirely, both of which had already been replaced for nothing. It pointed toward the wiring harness the dealership wanted to replace for $5,400. But Cole didn't think the whole harness was the problem. He thought something was interrupting the harness. He traced it by hand, section by section, the way his grandfather had traced a transmission 36 years earlier, patient, unhurried, checking connections one at a time instead of throwing parts at the problem. 2 hours in, running the combine on the grade again with the side panel off, he found it. A single wiring harness bundle had been rubbing, almost invisibly, against a sharp edge on the frame every time the machine flexed slightly on uneven, softer ground. The flex was worse on the grade, worse when the ground gave a little under the tires. Over 3 seasons, that rubbing had worn through the outer insulation onto wires bundled together, one carrying a crankshaft position signal, the other feeding the cab's accessory power, which explained the radio. When the frame flexed just right, on soft ground, under load, the 2 bare wires touched for a fraction of a second, sending a corrupted signal to the engine computer. The computer, doing exactly what it was designed to do, read that corrupted signal as a fault and cut power as a protective measure. Then the wires separated, the signal went clean again, and the computer let power back up, with nothing ever bad enough or consistent enough to trip a stored fault code. It wasn't a part failing. It was 2 wires touching that were never supposed to touch. In a spot no diagnostic protocol was built to check, because no engineer designs a wiring harness expecting it to wear through against its own frame. After 3 years of vibration on rough ground, you couldn't find it with a laptop. You could only find it by understanding, the way Cole did, that the story the machine was telling, power loss, no code, radio cutting out, worse on soft ground, was a story about something intermittent and physical, not something broken and permanent. The fix was $41 in wire. heat shrink tubing, and a piece of split loom to protect the new run, plus about 90 minutes of labor that Cole didn't charge for. Ellis ran the combine through the rest of that harvest without a single power drop, on ground wetter and rougher than what had triggered the problem before. Ellis Bramwell called the dealership in Kearney the following Monday, not to complain, but because he thought Russ Palladino, still running that service department, 22-year-old wall of certificates, now a very long career, ought to know what had actually been wrong. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then a question about who had found it. When Ellis said it was Daniel Kessler's boy, there was another pause. Russ said, "The Kessler kid, the young one?" Ellis said yes. Russ didn't say much after that. Word travels through a farming county the way water moves across flat ground, slow at first, then everywhere at once. By the end of that summer, Cole had a waiting list of his own, mostly for the class of problem that diagnostic computers were worst at catching. Intermittent faults, gradual wear, the kind of trouble that hides below the threshold a sensor is built to notice. He wasn't competing with the dealership, and he never framed it that way. The warranty work, the software updates, the jobs that needed factory-specific tooling, that stayed with Kearney. The problems that needed somebody willing to put their bare hand on cold steel and wait for it to tell them something, those came to Cole. Walter Kessler, 91 years old that summer and mostly confined to a chair by the window, heard the whole story secondhand from Daniel one evening after supper. He listened to all of it, the power drops, the $11,000 estimate, the to-bare wires touching on soft ground, and when Daniel finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said the same 6 words he'd said about every diagnosis in that family for 60 years. Going all the way back to a $2 thrust washer in a cold shed in 1983. He said, "The machine already told you." That was the whole of it. That was everything he'd ever meant to teach anyone. Cole Kessler is 22 years old now, and he runs a diagnostic service out of the same pole. Shit his great-grandfather worked in a century ago, on the same ground that's been in his family since 1919. He still keeps a notebook. It's his 5th. There are 11 of them on a shelf in that shed now, 2 of Walter's, 4 of Daniel's, 5 of Cole's, not organized by year or by machine, but by the questions that got asked and the answers that eventually showed up, which is really the only honest way to organize anything you've learned by living it. The equipment keeps getting more complicated. The sensors keep multiplying. The computers keep getting smarter, and most of the time, they catch what they're built to catch. And that's a good thing. Nobody in that family would tell you otherwise. But every so often, a machine develops a problem that lives in the gap between what a sensor was designed to notice and what's actually happening. And in that gap, a screen full of data is worth less than a person who learned the slow and unglamorous way, how to put their hand on something and wait for it to answer. Because that's the whole lesson, really, passed down through a $2 washer, a $5,000 wiring harness, and 3 generations of men who never once called it a lesson while they were teaching it. The machine is always telling you what's wrong. Most people have simply stopped being quiet enough to hear it.